Welcome to Know Better, Live Best. I am your host, Kari Ginger. Our guest today is currently serving as Miss Muscatine and was the first runner-up for Miss Iowa. Maggie Gehlsen started her own nonprofit called Trauma Queens, which is dedicated to helping survivors of sexual trauma heal their bodies and minds, utilizing holistic methods like movement and mindfulness. Maggie currently lives in Eastern Iowa and works as a personal trainer and health coach. Listen in as Maggie talks about surviving sexual assault and tips for those of you out there going through the same thing or stress of any kind. Know Better, Live Best is dedicated to supporting food and health literacy in people of all ages. Our mission is to cut through the misinformation surrounding food, health, and nutrition because we believe that when people know better, they can make the right choices and live their best lives. We are presented by Biteable Foods. They use blockchain and Internet of Things technology to build traceable, transparent food systems because it shouldn't take an investigative journalist to find out where food comes from. Well, hi, I'm here with Maggie Gehlsen. Hi, Maggie. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited for this. So tell the listeners a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so just kind of a standard background. I am the youngest of 5 kids. I am originally from Witt, Iowa, so small town over in Eastern Iowa. And I'm a 2013 graduate of DeWitt Central High School and a 2017 graduate of the University of Alabama. So I went there and got my undergrad. My bachelor's is in exercise science. So went there for that and then moved back recently to Iowa. And I'm loving being back in the Midwest. It's wonderful. So yeah, the South was definitely different, but a good experience. So now I am a health coach and I work at a coffee shop. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of what I'm doing now. I am I don't want to say retired pageant queen. I'm not sure if retirement is the word I want to use yet, but been doing pageants all my life. And I also started my own nonprofit. So that's kind of the general background about me.
Oh, so that's a pretty big background. So how old were you when you started pageants?
You know, I was actually 11, and the most common question that comes along with that is did your mom sign you up, or did your parents push you into pageants? Was it like toddlers and tiaras? And it totally wasn't. It was through, at that time, it was still through the Miss America organization. So, we did pretty much it was like a mini Miss Iowa. So it was, we competed in evening gown and interview and all of the same things. And I actually wanted to do it just because some girls at my baton studio were doing pageants.
Oh, sure.
So yeah, that's why I initially wanted to enter. My first pageant was Junior Miss Clinton County, and that was my first pageant that I won. So that was in 2007. So yeah.
I can only imagine the public speaking skills that come out of that. Something I can benefit from, but I can only imagine.
That's probably one of the biggest takeaways for sure. Kind of thinking back to my first onstage question to how I answer them now is definitely funny to make that correlation. So yeah, that's definitely been.
So you said, you're the youngest of 5.
Yes.
So brothers, sisters, what do you have?
I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. Yes.
Okay. So I'm one of 5. I'm actually the middle child,
okay.
But not quite a middle because I have 2 older brothers and 2 younger brothers. So I'm
gotcha. Okay.
Like the only girl.
Only girl.
So I don't know if you really count that as a middle child, but so big families are fun.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So aside from like the public speaking skills, what are some other skills you learned during your pageant time?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest things I think is I've learned resilience has been probably I think that's the first word that comes to mind when I think of pageantry. And most people, I don't think people will ever understand that unless they've actually been in a pageant or done that before. But it's one of those things that it's like a sport. It's like your full-time job. You work so hard for X period of time leading up to this one major event. And then that event it either works out or it doesn't.
Right.
And so it's very like cut and dry in that way. But pageants are also always very subjective. So that's another thing to keep in mind when you're doing them. But yeah, resilience is definitely the biggest thing. I don't think if it hadn't taught me resilience, I don't think I would have continued as far as I did with pageants. So that's definitely the word that I think of the most.
Well, I think you have to. I mean, there's one winner basically that comes out of that.
Yeah,
There's so many women that
absolutely.
enter, so you have to
Yeah,
be
yeah,
resilient.
yeah, for sure. It's certainly not easy, knowing that fact, but I think it's also what makes them so rewarding is that, even though there's one winner, you're still always going to take something away when you leave that pageant. So I like to say, every pageant that I've done has taught me something different. So yeah, that's always great to keep in mind.
Okay, so with what you know now, what would you hope to share with those that are maybe just starting out in
Yeah.
pageants?
I would think for me, the biggest thing, and this is something that's been kind of on on repeat in my head since June. In June, I was first runner-up to Miss Iowa. So I spent, a good chunk of my life being like, Miss Iowa's the goal. I'm going to be Miss Iowa
Mhm.
someday. Saying all those things to myself, and then I got really, really close, and it didn't work out. And
Right.
so, bearing all of that in mind, I think the biggest takeaway and the thing that I would tell another person who's just starting out is let that pain or that struggle, let it teach you something. Losing that was not just something where, you know oh, I lost a pageant, whatever. That was my dream for like
Yes.
11 years. So it's kind of like I always say too, that the grieving process and the learning curve that comes with letting that go. So I think the biggest thing is, yeah, just letting that pain have some kind of purpose and letting it teach you something about yourself, because pain, for me, pain always equals information. So
Mhm.
if I can keep that in mind, I can always know that I'm going to come through that pain with learning something else that I hadn't known before.
Well, and that's a great takeaway, like I said, not just from pageants, but like you
Mhm.
said, life in general. There's always going to be ups and
Yeah,
downs in your life. What are you going to learn from the mistakes, or what are
absolutely.
you going to learn from, the failures, if that's what you want to call it?
Yes.
Because I think a lot
Yeah.
comes from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's relevant for, if you had a dream job, it's no different than that. Being Miss Iowa was my dream job. So, say you had a dream job and they chose the other candidate, or, whatever, things like that. I think that's all very applicable to pageantry in that way.
So, what was your biggest takeaway when you were first runner up?
I think that I actually was way more proud of myself than I had ever like given myself credit for. Um, this last year of my life, I moved home from school, and I spent pretty much the entire year preparing for Miss Iowa and preparing to be Miss Iowa, and knowing that I could do the job, and trying to give myself as many experiences that would allow me to prove to the judges that I was the most prepared for the job. And all of those experiences were so valuable. And so I think for me, if when they announced the winner, so first runner up is always, I always say this, that it's the hardest job in the entire room the night of a pageant, because you don't get your name announced, you don't get hardly any recognition. So it's kind of like, it really is I have a very soft spot for any first runner up of a pageant, because you really don't get a lot of recognition. At that moment, it's all about the winner. So,
Right.
um, so I think at that moment, I was so proud of how far I had come, but of course it was devastating, and of course it was
Yeah.
hard to do that. But also the girl who won was my roommate, and she was a girl who I was really good friends with. So that was also really sweet. So it's
Mhm.
it was one of those moments where after that, it's definitely been a challenge the last couple of months, trying to like figure out, well, what am I going to do next? This whole time I was planning that this next year of my life would be devoted to being Miss
Right.
Iowa. So yeah, that's kind of been the challenge at hand as of lately. But again, yeah, I think letting that pain just kind of teach you something is always a good mantra to keep in mind, just so that you can work through it and heal as much as possible before you enter the next phase of life. So
Right.
yeah.
Which is,
Yeah.
I mean, where you are right now, and you've developed something pretty cool. So, Trauma Queens. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, Trauma Queens is a nonprofit I started in June of 2017, and its basic mission is to provide survivors of sexual assault and sexual violence the tools that they need to learn how to heal their bodies and minds in a holistic way. So, kind of taking back their bodies after that trauma. And that's something that kind of coincides with my bachelor's degree. My bachelor's is in exercise physiology. So I sort of, I picked that degree for a very basic love of health.
Sure.
And then it evolved into so much more after my assault when I was 21. So it kind of, in a way, became sort of like a science project. I sort of was using myself as this experiment to see what methods were going to work for me that weren't strictly, medication or, or just talk therapy. What other methods could I use to heal myself in the wake of this trauma? So that's kind of where it all came from. And it's evolving nicely. It's still new and it's still young, but it's something that I'm really excited about for the future.
So that's the exciting part about it. And my just journey to better health, just like joint issues and back issues, things like that, which also helps mental health when you're really focusing on it as well. I think everyone can benefit from that. But when you said, hopefully without medication, obviously medication, some people need it, but
Absolutely.
It's nice to work away from it if you can. And I love that you are trying to do that for yourself, and then just the other women or even, men out there that go through something like this that is life altering. And I think you can only understand it if you have truly been a victim
right
yourself, and you're not hiding, you're getting out there and you're, helping other women hopefully talk about it and find other ways to help out with that. And I just think it's an amazing thing. So I'm sure it was really hard for you.
Thank you.
First.
Yeah. At first it was sort of one of those things where, like you said, you don't know until you've been there. So, I think for me, I say this, very like loosely, but like, quote, luckily I had an assault that happened when I was 15 as well. So it was sort of like one of those things where I knew what the process was going to look like from that moment forward. I knew what the healing at first was going to look like. And it wasn't going to be pretty and it wasn't going to be easy, but I knew that, I was like, okay, therapy, that's going to be like first step, So I think for me, it was in that moment, I thought to myself, oh yeah, like, of course, those are the things that I have to do to heal myself. Whereas, if it had been my first assault, then I probably would have been like, what do I even, where do I go first? So I actually had some kind of background of where to go, which I think ended up in turn being beneficial. So it's one of those things that, for me, medication was never the answer. I've been diagnosed with panic disorder, depression, general anxiety disorder, and PTSD. At the time, I think I was 20, it was all four. So, that's something that I thought to myself, I was like, if I can just try and do this medication free, I didn't like the way that they made me feel. And I wanted to be able to utilize, activity, movement of some kind, like yoga or even strength training now, and mindfulness, meditation, just being still with my breath. And, nutrition was a big part of it too, which, again, is what ties in with Bytable's, mission is that, nutrition was kind of a key component of how I was ever going to heal my body, and it still is. So, and it will be for the rest of my life. So keeping all of those things in mind, I think I had a really good, like, solid foundation of where to go after the assault had happened.
Well, it's amazing after, starting this podcast and talking to people of all different walks of life. And we keep coming back to the same thing. It's like mindfulness, nutrition, taking care of your body, listening to your body. And it's for everything. It's not just for someone who wants to look good. It's, how's your body feeling? How's your mind? I think it'd be rare to find someone who says they're sound all the time. No problems. I think it would be, I don't think you can find someone out there. Stress is in everyday life, no matter what you go through. And then it brought you to this with this obviously two awful things that have happened to you, but you've chosen to take it and help other people. That's brave. That's brave in itself. So is there anything big you've really learned about the mind-body connection then through this?
Yes, definitely. So when I first started therapy, I started therapy when I was 19. So I actually didn't speak about my first assault until I was 19. And then that's when my platform for pageants changed, and my platform then became this whole platform that was based around preventing sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
And then Trauma Queens, of course, came a little bit later. But yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing was I started therapy, and I started doing a really intense kind of therapy called EMDR therapy, which is a very, very common therapy used with survivors of rape, survivors of, war veterans, people who have endured intense traumas. So I started doing EMDR therapy, and I was so thrown by it, because one of the main goals of EMDR therapy is to basically activate both sides of your brain. So activating both the left side and the right side of your brain. So typically in a very basic EMDR setting, they'll have you either hold two like vibrating little, can't even like think of the word for them, but they're like two, like circular things that you would hold in your hands, and they vibrate back and forth. Or they could tap your knees back and forth. Something where there's a movement going from side to side that's going to activate both the left side and the right side of your brain. And basically what it does is your therapist or the person who's facilitating it will bring up whatever traumatic memory or whatever that you have from that experience, and get you into the state of where you're about to basically relive that memory. Or for me, it was always like, get me to the point of almost having a panic attack. And then what they do is they basically help you to reinstate a positive thought that comes into play. So for me, it was always like, I'm safe, I'm going to be okay, like things like that. So kind of incorporating a positive mantra with it. And for me, I remember I'd go home from those therapy sessions and I'd sleep for like 12 plus hours, because I was just so exhausted physically. So, that mind-body connection was definitely established in therapy, but now it's something that I utilize in, my everyday life. I know that, the best way to avoid a panic attack is to stick with my meditation practice.
Right.
Going to yoga is something where like, breathe into that spot of your body, and you'll probably be able to extend it more, things like that. So yeah, the mind-body connection was definitely established for me in therapy, but has facilitated into other areas of my life now. So yeah.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I'm almost embarrassed to even say this. So I'm an educator. I'm getting ready to go back to work, which I'm excited about. I love my job.
Yeah.
However, with my three little ones, mainly my 1-year-old, I'm having a hard time getting all the work done. It'll get done, but it's one of those things you put stress on yourself because you want everything to be perfect. Like I'm actually doing great. I'm having bits of hair fall out, and it's from stress. I'm like, okay, Kari, I think you need to find something else. Like, I don't feel that stressed, but I think that's me like shoving it down. If I have hair falling out.
Oh yeah, no. And that's totally like, people do that all the time. Like, I have to really catch myself sometimes and be like, is there an emotion or something that I'm stuffing down that I actually really need to release or let go of? I always say, like, for me, I'm always like, I love to cry. And people are always like, oh, what? Like, that sounds really awful and morbid. And I'm like, no, like, it's the best. Like, and that's kind of, again, going back to that, like, therapy that I did, that was always like a big component of it, was like, they get you to the brink of like crying or breaking down. And I think that always was like such a release that now I'm like, okay, well, if I need to release an emotion, the best way to do that is to just have a good cry.
Right.
So yeah, I think we all kind of have stressors that we can't always recognize. And then our body is like, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to send you this signal here through your hair falling out, or a panic attack, or, or like whatever, that happens.
Or just different pains in your body. This is another one.
Yeah.
I am floored. So I've been going out to my classroom, obviously, here and there. And my back's been doing great. So I had back surgery about a year ago, and then I've been trying to heal it outside of that as well. And it's been doing really well. But I go back to my classroom and it starts hurting. I'm like, I'm not doing anything where this back should hurt. And I just find it hilarious. I'm home and I'm picking up my daughter and I'm bending down doing this, and it feels great. I'm like, okay, Kari, you need to calm down. Because I think it's that striving for perfection. You want things to go so well. And so you put the stress on yourself. It's nothing I can't work through. But now I'm realizing it and talking with you about this mind-body connection. I'm like, I need to be a little more in tune, or like take a breath or something.
Right. Well, and it's so hard to like remember to even, our lives are so busy and there's so much going on that we hardly remember to like take a breath, let alone, spend 10 minutes meditating or, whatever. So it's challenging, and yeah, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be perfect and to, do things absolutely perfect and get it right the first time. And that's just not how life works. And it's like the harshest reality of life, I think.
It's like not real. It's like, come on.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
is funny. It's like, I feel like at my age, and I know that. So why am I still doing it?
Right. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, it's definitely like, we always kind of forget it, I think, at certain
I
points.
know.
So yeah, I mean, it takes time for sure. I
Right.
totally understand.
So, and we were probably touching on it right now, but what do you wish maybe you knew a little more about, I guess through this all, or what would you suggest maybe to survivors or anything? I mean, that would just be more helpful for them.
Yeah. Gosh, the first thing that comes to mind is, um, and this goes for both like mental and physical strength, but like you are absolutely, I wish somebody would have told me like you're stronger than you could ever possibly know, because I think mentally that applies because, I'm able to, I was telling a friend of mine the other day, I said, I have trained myself so well to operate so well in like high stress situations that I could be like full fight or flight and be on stage like emceeing a pageant. Like I told someone, because I emceed a pageant like a month ago, and like the whole time, like no one would have ever known, but the whole time I was standing up there and I just was like, my heart was like racing and I was like, what is going on? And it's like, I think the human body is so incredibly miraculous and resilient. And it's like, it is the greatest tool that we have. It is the greatest gift that we have. And so I think that, yeah, I just wish I wish I knew the strength that I had physically and mentally, like, mentally, just being able to be like, I'm going to be okay. My senior year of college, my assault happened about a week before my senior year began. And I remember like there were nights where I would call my mom crying at like 1 a.m. Like this is like, my mom is like, I'm her youngest kid. Like she's, my parents are so ready to be done with like parenting. I think like they've been raising for like 40 years. So, but I'd call her like in the middle of the night and just be like, I used to be, like survivors typically have like a lot of, and just people with general anxiety, disorder, they typically have like little tics, like one thing that they'll get stuck on that they can't, especially people with like OCD too, one thing they get stuck on that they can't back away from, that they're really terrified of. So for me, it was seizures. Like having a seizure was always my biggest fear. I had a friend who passed away during a seizure, so it was like that was always like a subconscious fear I had that ended up coming to the surface after my assault. So I always had this fear, like, I'm going to have a seizure. I'm going to be alone. It's going to be awful, and I would call her and just be like full blown in a panic attack. And then, I'd wake up the next day and I'd be like, I'm alive. Like I'm here. Like, this is good. Like the body is so incredibly resilient. Like the stress that I think about that my body's endured and still come out on the other side just fine. It's unbelievable to me. So I think if I had a piece of advice, it would just be to kind of keep that in the back of your brain that, you are stronger than you will ever possibly be able to fathom. So, yeah, that's my biggest takeaway, I think, for sure.
Oh my goodness. You are so right. It's one of those things that everyone needs to know. Like I said, the last year I've really come more interested in the mind-body connection just at the beginning stages. So this is so fun talking to you. But because everything that's come up in my life, I'm like, I think it's led me to this podcast to learn more about it. I'm just, like I said, loving every bit about it and talking to all these awesome people. And people need to know you will be okay because your body is strong. We are made to be strong. We are made to, persevere. We are, resilient. It's amazing. So I love that you gave that advice. I think all listeners are agreeing with you right now, because they can all come with, just a situation where they felt that, something wasn't going to be okay. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to take time and that you're not going to have to work at it, but you can do it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I love that.
Yeah. That was definitely, I think, something that I also kind of learned through my therapy, through that EMDR therapy. That was something where like, there were times where I was like, there's no way my body can like withstand this kind of like stress. Right. And then, and then now looking back, of course, almost 2 years later, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I was going to be okay. So you have no idea until you come out on the other side. So yeah, it's definitely, I think that's been the biggest takeaway for me.
So you've had, so like the pageants and your therapy, and I mean, you're just a strong individual in general. Obviously it shows right now. So who were some like your biggest supporters that really helped you? I mean, obviously your mom.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Your mom, I'm sure she played a huge part in this.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
People that were really with you that were helping you see this through.
Yes. I would say, my parents were a big part of it. My boyfriend at the time was a huge component of that healing journey. People never really understand like how challenging an assault is for not just the person who it's happened to, but like family members and friends and people like significant others, like that all was definitely really challenging. So for all of them. So definitely my parents, they were like the biggest supporters for me. My significant other, my siblings were all really supportive of me. So, my sisters especially, just because I think they're two people who I talk to regularly. So, they were so supportive, my brothers too. But it's something that definitely women can identify with, I think, almost a little bit more. And so, which is not to say it doesn't happen to men. Of course it does. But yeah, my sisters were certainly super helpful on that journey and still are. So all of my college friends who, like, especially my roommates, the people who I lived with at that time, I think, they will never know like how much I appreciated all of the things that they did. Just because I think, when you're grieving and when you're hurting and when you're going through a really challenging time and people do like the smallest thing for you and you think it's like the biggest deal. So like my friend one time, like I remember she like ordered me food or like went and got me food somewhere like a few days after. And I just started crying because I was like, oh my God, like, I was like, this is so sweet. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think like the little things were so helpful. And I hope that's something that maybe hearing this, they'll be able to hear and know how much I appreciated that. But yeah, my friends, my therapist, both of them, the one that I had in Tuscaloosa and the one that I have now, are both phenomenal people. And that process would not have been, it couldn't have been done without either of them. So I often say like the hardest person that I left in Tuscaloosa was my therapist. So yeah, she was great. And she was so helpful. She saved my life for sure. So yeah, there were so many people. And I think that's another thing to note is that I recognize my privilege in that regard because I understand that there's plenty of survivors out there who don't have that support system. So for me, it was like when I started to tell people, I was like floored at the response that I got because it was just, everybody was so supportive and you don't always think that they're going to be with something as delicate and as kind of heavy as sexual assault. So it was something that like when I told people, I was like, wow, I was just floored with their response. So yeah, I'm definitely thankful for every single person. Right. And been there and showed any kind of support. So yeah, absolutely.
Well, and I'm sure not everyone always is, or they might want to support, but they don't know how.
Absolutely.
It might come off.
Yes.
Wrong.
Totally.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You're totally right. There's so many like intricacies with sexual assault that like no one thinks about. Like it's a topic that like, when like you can't just like walk into a room and like be like, hey, like I'm a survivor of sexual assault, because like most people will be uncomfortable unless you're like walking into a support group or something. So like, of course that's not the first thing I lead with in a conversation meeting someone new. I always want to tell them about like the awesome things that came after, so like trauma queens, that's always something I'm like, yeah, I'll talk to people about that. Because, then they can get to know my story and I can kind of invite them in through that avenue. But yeah, it's like, it is one of those topics that's touchy to talk about. It just is. And it's my hope that we can kind of change that a little bit, make it a little bit more accepting for people to talk about. So yeah. And I think that comes with kind of just getting the message out that, trauma to the body, whether it be, sexual violence or anything else, trauma to the body, trauma to the mind, all of those things have to be healed at some point. So, and everybody has those, everybody has traumas that have happened to them. So, whether they know it or not. So there's a lot of kind of overlap, I think, with trauma queens and the general population, just because there are a lot of people who have unhealed wounds that need to be healed and can be healed through, like those holistic methods we talked about, and proper nutrition and movement and mindfulness and all of that good stuff. So yeah, it's my hope that there's a lot of overlap maybe with the average human too. So yeah.
Oh, I think it is. And I think anyone who's gone through, like I said, it's a good chunk of people that have been through trauma at some point in their life is knowing that, you will be okay. You can do this because you are in charge of yourself, and find your support system or find what works for you. Like, don't succumb.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I'm sure I can only imagine how easy that would be.
Yeah.
How easy it would just, stop, because that's awful. It changes your brain.
It does.
It changes your brain.
Yeah. There's actually this really like fascinating kind of world of neuroscience that's called, I believe it's called neuroplasticity. And it's kind of like the idea that we can, in the aftermath of trauma or in the aftermath of something really painful or really challenging, difficult loss, anything like that, that we can basically rewire our brain to think differently about situations. So this is really beneficial for a lot of people who have been through trauma. It's a beneficial thing for them to know, because it makes them feel like there's some kind of hope, and that there's some kind of like, okay, I can take this awful thing that happened and I can do something with it. There's a fantastic book called Option B, and it's by Sheryl Sandberg, who was the CEO, or COO of Facebook. I can't remember what her title was, but she wrote it kind of in the aftermath of the loss of her husband. So, and she talks a lot about that, about how, grieving and just loss in general can really help to reshape your brain and the way that you think about things. And I know it certainly has for me, only for the better, I think. There's a lot of parts of me that think so much differently about things now. And I never would have, I think, had that experience had I not, had that awful thing happen. But, in turn, it made me grateful. So yeah, that's kind of neuroscience is always really interesting to me in terms of trauma. So yeah, that's something I've learned.
I want to check that book out. So are there other resources out there for those? I would think especially for those that maybe are struggling with, whatever they're going through, that maybe a small place to start.
Mm-hmm. I would say, Option B was definitely a book that helped me a lot. I think too, because the title itself, especially for me right now in my life, is just is super relevant. Like, option A might not have worked, but there's always an option B. So Option B is a great, great read. I have so many like self-help books, like my entire desk, like where I'm sitting right now, has all these self-help books. So I'm like trying to look around and think like which ones were the best. But, I think for me, the biggest thing was, reading was really helpful, but I recognize that some people don't always, want to read about like, especially survivors. Like for me, I didn't want to read about any other survivors and their stories for a while. So I great, because it just kind of gave me an outlet that gave me resources and things to turn to in the wake of trauma. But I think if people are going to start anywhere, the first place I would start would be talk therapy. And there's a fantastic resource called psychologytoday.com where people can find therapists in their area who specialize in certain things. So that would be, and it's all like you can specialize it to your insurance and things like that. So I think that would be an awesome resource for people I think everybody should go to therapy. It's like a personal belief of mine. So I think everyone should go. And then I think, if people can swing it, I think, downloading some kind of meditation app to sort of help you as you start your meditation journey. Meditation has wonderful benefits, aside from the fact that it helps with things like depression and anxiety and panic disorder and all of that. It's a fantastic way to help kind of, again, rewire your brain to think a little bit differently, like, to help you understand that you're safe and that your body is safe and it's a safe place to be. And so I think, meditation, starting some kind of practice in that realm is really important. I use an app that's called Simple Habit, and it's amazing. It's like you can do meditations anywhere, and it has something for every kind of like phase of life. So it's an amazing app. And then I think my last, little tidbit of resources that I would say would be of the utmost importance is to journal. And that was something that, I look back on my journals from like the time right after my assault, and it is like unbelievable. Like the transition from then to now is like, it's remarkable. It's like, oh my gosh, I did, like I wrote about all of these things and wrote all these feelings down, and to see that transition into the way that I think now and the way that I write now is really, I think, a beautiful thing and has helped tremendously. So I think if you can journal and practice some kind of mindfulness, that those are all great resources to utilize, and all basically free, so all things that you can do from the comfort of your home, and you don't have to go anywhere for them. So those would be my biggest resources, I think, for anybody who is struggling with any kind of challenge in their life.
Right. I think I might check out that Simple Habit.
It's great. Amazing. It's so great. It's free for like when you first start it. You can keep the free version, but I actually pay monthly for like the upgraded one, because I like love all of the meditations. Like they're so specific. Like there's some for like meditation for flying and like, all of that stuff. So I'm such a nerd. I'm like, I want to have all the meditations I need. So
Absolutely. Especially if it's helping you so much. That's when it's worth the money.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're feeling better.
Yeah.
So like, where can our listeners find you? Because I'm going to have a hard time believing that they're not going to want to check out like trauma queens and things we talked about. So how can they find you out there?
Thanks. So the easiest place to find me on the internet these days is on Instagram. You can find Trauma Queens. It's at trauma_queens. It's Trauma Queens Instagram. And then my personal Instagram is just at @mgehlsen. So those are the two best places to find me. I'm also on Twitter, because like Twitter is like my favorite place on the internet. So like that's like where I go if I need a good laugh. And then you can also find me on Facebook. I'm happy to chat with anybody about, resources if they need any things that really helped me. I'm happy to talk about all of that. I also have a blog that I write on, and I had made a promise to myself that I'm going to write on this blog like much more regularly, because before Miss Iowa, things just kind of got crazy. But it's mmgehlsen.blogspot.com. So that's linked up to my personal Instagram. So those are kind of all the places where I'm at. And my blog is definitely, if you're in need of hopefully some inspiration in terms of a life transition, you can go to my blog and hopefully that'll help you out, because I'm there too. So.
Well, you're so relatable. I think people will just go and find you and be like, yes, okay. You probably see you as like, oh, runner up, Miss Iowa, all these amazing things, but to know that you're human.
That's the biggest misconception ever. That's like the funniest thing when people are like, oh, you've done pageants I've looked up to you for so long. I'm like, why? I'm literally such a human. Like, I'm a mess half the time. So I'm happy to chat with anybody about any additional resources that they may need.
Well, thanks, Maggie. I mean, you're so open and honest, and I know the listeners are going to relate to that and just be very appreciative. And I know I am. And like I said, I learned a lot too, as always.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure to chat with you. I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Maggie. We'll get excited to get this out on the internet for everyone to listen to soon.
Yay, sounds good. I'm so excited.
Thanks, Maggie.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.